Watercolours can definitely be a very unforgiving medium, and if you make a mistake, it can feel like you've ruined your entire painting. But what if you could easily erase those mistakes whenever you wanted? Well, I have discovered something that allows you to do exactly that. So let's see if it actually works. Hey everybody, my name is Kirsty and my aim is to help you improve your art skills so that you can create paintings that you are really proud of. In this video, I'm going to be testing out the Magic Watercolour Sponge Eraser by a company called Frisk, and I found this on Amazon and I was really interested to see if it would work and if it will actually do what it claims it will do, which is remove any unwanted watercolour from your paintings. When I first looked at it, I just thought it looked like any other normal sponge, so I was really interested to see whether it'd work. Now, for this painting demonstration, I'm going to be using my tube watercolour paint, and I use the Holbein watercolours, but if you want to test this out yourself, you can use any watercolour paint that you want. And I will also be using the Fabriano Artistico cold pressed watercolour paper. But again, any watercolour paper will do. A few other supplies that I'll be using in this video are my watercolour brushes. I'm using my round and flat watercolour paintbrushes, and I'm just going to be using a tea towel to blot off some excess water and paint, and a water jar. I'll also be using some really pretty washi tapes to create the borders of my paintings, and again, I got these off of Amazon and I just love using washi tape. I think it just adds such a nice colourful look to your work whilst you're painting. I'm going to be doing two different little studies in this video, so I'm actually going to split my watercolour paper into two squares using the washi tape to create a nice border. And because these sponges are just enormous, I actually decided to cut them down into more manageable, small little cubes that I can use to erase smaller areas. But if you are working on really large paintings, then I suppose you won't have to cut them quite as small. Just cut it to whatever size you'll need for your painting. The first thing that I want to do is test out this Magic Eraser on wet paint, so to see how well it lifts up paint when it's wet, which should technically be a lot easier to do than when it's dried into the paper. So for the first study, I'm actually going to paint a snowy scenery, and I'm just approaching it like I would any other painting, just laying down the colours. I'm using the wet on wet technique there. And I want there to be some snow in the foreground. So I'm actually wetting that sponge, squeezing out all of the excess water, and I'm just actually starting to dab some of the paint off on the bottom half of that painting. I keep squeezing and cleaning out the sponge before going back in to remove some more of the paint. And you can see that on the wet painting, it actually is removing the paint quite well, but it does leave a bit of a purple stain behind. It's not exactly lifting it completely back to white. So even though it is working well, I wouldn't say it's erasing the paint completely. There's definitely a little bit of staining going on, and you do need to clean out your sponge quite often, because it will get dirty and then it won't work as well. It will actually deposit some of that paint onto the paper if your sponge is just soaked in paint. I'm also using it to create a cloudy effect. So I wanted to see if it could be used to actually create effects in your painting rather than just removing mistakes. And I found that it worked really nicely to create that fluffy, cloudy, snowy look in the sky. So I definitely recommend this sponge for creating cool effects. Once the painting was dry, I'm going in and actually adding some detail to the painting. So I'm adding a line of trees in the distance using a really dark shade of blue. I believe that was Payne's Grey. And then I'm just adding a bit of detail to the snow at the front, adding a few little plants, a few slightly bigger trees closer to the foreground. And you can see that I was able to use that sponge to create the snow in the front. It was able to remove quite a lot of the paint, to be honest. So it is good if you're painting away and then you think, oh, actually, I would like a bit of snow down here, but I've already painted it this purple colour. It was good for removing most of the paint. But then again, I've also found that tissue would work in the same way and get a very similar result. So if you don't want to spend money on this sponge, then I would recommend just using kitchen roll, and when your paint is wet, just pressing down on the paint, and that will lift the colour up just as well as this sponge does. I wanted to test out this sponge even more, so I decided to add a mountain in the background of this painting. So I used the sponge to remove the paint where the mountain would be, and then I'm going in with a bit more paint and darkening up the sky around the mountain to help the mountain pop out a little bit more. And you can see that the mountain does look quite white. I was able to lift a lot of that colour, especially now that the paint had had a bit more time to settle into the paper. It was a bit more impressive now that it had dried a bit to see that it was still able to remove quite a bit of the paint up. I'm just finishing off this painting with my white gel pen, just adding a few little dots to make it look sparkly and a bit more snowy. Overall, I would say that the sponge did a great job at removing the wet paint, and the next thing that we're going to try out is to see if the sponge works just as well at removing dry paint that has already dried and settled into the paper. Before we move on to the second painting, if you are struggling with your watercolours, then I have got a free watercolour class where I go through lots of tips and techniques to help you improve your paintings. So I'll leave a link to that at the top of the description if you're interested, but let's get back into the second experiment. For this second study, I'm going to be painting some fire. So I'm going to be using bright reds and oranges and even darker brown tones. So it'll be interesting to see how the sponge works at removing darker paint. And again, I'm starting off by using the wet in wet technique, which is where I pre-wet the paper first with clean water and then add the paint over the top. And this just helps to avoid harsh edges to your painting. And I'm going in with my dark sort of brown tone to actually add a really dark background to the fire and even add some of the shadows in the fire. Now I'm keeping it all quite loose at the moment. And then I waited for that painting to completely dry, and I'm going in with the wet sponge and I'm trying to remove some of that paint. And I'm actually going to use this sponge to try and create the look of flames in the fire and add those sort of textures to this painting. So I'm not using it to remove mistakes, but in fact to create the textures and shapes of the flames. And I found that it works quite well at lightening up the paint, removing some of it to create these nice shapes. And if you don't press as hard or scrub as much, then you are able to just lighten up the paint a little bit to create some details and textures and cool effects with this sponge. So you don't just have to use it if you want to remove the paint to white. You can use it just to lift the paint a little bit to create details and textures like I'm doing here. But if you are removing dark paint or really vibrant colours, then you will need to keep rinsing out your sponge quite often, otherwise you can end up muddying your colours by transferring the paint to areas that you don't want it. Now I am really experimenting with this sponge, so I'm sort of trying things that I wouldn't usually, just sort of getting loose with it and experimenting, trying out new things. So this isn't going to be the best fire painting in the world, but I just wanted to push the sponge, see how much I could remove the paint, how white I could get it. and I found that it was able to lift the dark brown tone quite a lot. But I did have to make multiple passes over the dark areas in order to lift up that paint. So I will say that if you use the sponge, it can be very easy for the sponge to damage your watercolor paper and actually pull up some of the paper texture and make it a bit crumbly if you overwork the sponge into an area. So you want to be careful when you use the sponge that you don't damage your paper, and that's why it's important to use high quality watercolor paper if you're using this sponge and this technique. So do be careful, you don't want to scrub too hard. I prefer to use a dabbing motion when I'm using this sponge. I found that that really helps to reduce the amount of stress on the paper. Now I'm just going in with an even darker colour. I decided that I wanted to make the background even darker and more of a bluey black shade rather than brown. And you can see that our fire is coming together now and looking a bit more like a fire. Overall, this sponge did work well, but it was quite expensive considering you can get the same result by just using tissue like kitchen roll. I use that quite often to lift up paint and to create textures. Kitchen roll works exactly the same and is a lot cheaper and is something you probably already have around the house. So to be honest, I wouldn't really recommend using this. I don't think that I will be using it much for my future paintings because I don't really see a place for it. I found that kitchen roll will work just as well, be a lot cheaper. But let me know what you guys think if you've tested out this sponge yourself. And here you can see the final two paintings using the Magic Watercolor Eraser Sponge. And remember that if you do want to improve your watercolor skills, I have got that free class. I'll leave a link at the top of the description if you want to check that out. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye everybody.